Today, we are talking all about consistency and how sometimes high achievers think that if they just controlled things a little tighter, a little better, got a little bit more rigid and disciplined, they could be more consistent and accomplish their goals. Well, today I'm going to talk about why that might not be a helpful approach. Welcome to Burnout Solutions. My name is Mona Tippett. I am a registered nurse, a life coach, an emotional resiliency expert, and a mom. I love to help healthcare workers and caretakers and just busy, capable people understand their brain and nervous system so stress, overwhelm, and frustration do not run their life. Here on this podcast, we break down burnout, emotional overload, and survival patterns in simple human language. I love to give you practical ways to feel safer, calmer, and more present in your everyday life. You do not need fixing. What you need is support and a nervous system that knows that it's safe. Thanks for being here. Hello. Welcome back to the podcast. I have been doing so much thinking about being consistent since I did my webinar about loving yourself to health. And there's something about helping people with their health and being consistent in one area of your life that tends to spread out into other areas of your life. And a lot of times when we say we want to be more consistent, we think about our health, right? Or more consistent with our workouts, more consistent with our menu and our eating. Sometimes we, as parents, want to be more consistent, showing up calmly for our children, more consistent in how we take care of our patients or those people around us. And often when I see this with high achievers and even with myself, when we decide to be more consistent, we like to tighten control. We double down. We white knuckle. We set stricter rules, tighter boundaries, tighter parameters, and we ask, okay, did I follow this rule exactly? And if I did, yes, I'm being consistent. If I didn't, then I'm not. Because control is what high achievers are really good at, and that is usually the way that they lean to make changes in their life. But here's what I want to explore today is that being in control is not necessarily being resilient. And rigid consistency is not the same thing at being sustainable in our consistency. And of course, the difference that I see is what zone your nervous system is in. Today, I'm going to talk about how we can use our nervous system to make a consistent, resilient change. And if we don't understand this, we often can cycle between pressure and rules and collapse. So let's just dive in a little bit. In the business world, there's a difference between compliance and control and consistency. And compliance or control is following the rules. It's meeting external standards. It's doing the minimum required to avoid consequences. Consistency, though, is different. Consistency is repeated. It's reliable action over time. It's working on internal, where control is often external. It is cultural. It is identity-based. Control says, did I follow the rules? Consistency can say, am I showing up repeatedly? But often what happens in our personal lives is we treat consistency like control when we are high achievers. And our internal dialogue says things like, did I do it exactly? Did I stick to the plan perfectly? Did I mess up? How am I doing? And we love checking off boxes. We love that dopamine hit of, yes, I did it. And often that mindset can create pressure. And that pressure, of course, lives in hyperarousal, fight or flight. And I want to explore that just a little bit and answer the question, what does the hyperarousal version of consistency look like? Well, I've said it already that when we are in hyperarousal, there is a feeling of urgency. There is a feeling of control. There's a feeling of I need to meet a deadline. And often that control creates thoughts of black and white thinking. It presents that there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. It often puts us into all or nothing thinking. In that hyperarousal, we create strict schedules. We create, like I said, box checking and following the plan and asking, did I do it perfectly? And it often feels very productive. It often does actually yield results. And people can be very successful in their life this way. This also looks very disciplined on paper, right? And this is where people kind of struggle is, okay, but that has brought me the success that I have. Okay, but what I want to say is underneath all of that is fear. And fear is a very good motivator. And it's also a poor way, in my opinion, to base your life on and your decisions on. It can get results, but it often leads to burnout. And what are people scared of when they're using fear? Well, fear of losing progress, fear of failing, fear of being the kind of person who can't follow through, who can't make progress, fear of what other people think of us, fear of our own self-judgment. And often when we are using fear in that way, we tighten up and we think that tightening up equals more strength and that we can accomplish more. And sometimes we do, but again, eventually we burn out because rigid things tend to break, whereas flexible things tend to bend. There is a movie called Buck that my husband loves, and it's about a cowboy. Maybe I've talked about it before on here. It's really good. He's called The Horse Whisperer. And at the end, his foster mom says, "Blessed be the flexible, because they will not be bent out of shape." And I love that. And since I have heard that, I think about it quite often. I wanted to tell a story where I learned a little bit about being flexible. Several years ago, when I was, a pretty new nurse, I worked in the newborn intensive care unit, and I loved being a NICU nurse. I didn't train or really choose to be a NICU nurse. I had floated there from labor and delivery and liked it, and I liked the staff, and I loved the schedule of being a NICU nurse. And as a NICU nurse, and other nurses use this too, we had a brain, which was a piece of paper that we wrote everything down on. So when our meds due, when our feedings due, when should I expect that the doctor's going to round, when our care's done, that kind of thing. So as a high achieving nurse, I loved this paper or this brain because I love to plan my shift. I love sticking to the schedule that I had planned for the next 12 hours. And again, there's something very satisfying about executing the schedule exactly as written down. So one shift, I had 3 babies that I was taking care of, and I noticed that they were all due to eat within the same hour. So every 3 hours. And if you don't know, in the NICU, they want to regularly feed the babies so that they gain weight and they grow. And we do want to feed them often. So anyway, I had 3 babies that were due to eat at the same time. And one of the moms had called and said, "Hey, I'm going to be coming in to feed my baby at this time. If you could wait." I said, okay. So in my mind, I built the plan. This baby will be fed by the mom, and then these other 2 babies I can feed, probably within 30 minutes. And I adjusted the plan and timed it all out, and everything looked great. And then real life happened. And when it was time to feed, 2 of the 3 babies were asleep, but what baby was fussy, crying, and hungry? Well, the baby whose mom was coming. And so I waited, and I held the baby and gave her a pacifier, and the mom didn't come. She didn't show up. So I waited and I waited and I waited. And the other two babies were just snoozing away, happy as can be, not eating. And they continued to sleep. And so 20 minutes passed and I couldn't call her because I had these other two babies that needed to be fed. And I was feeling behind in that moment that here it was 20 minutes into the time that all three babies needed to eat and none of them had been fed. So I made the decision and I fed the crying baby. And of course, as soon as I finished feeding the baby, the mom walked in. She had been stuck in traffic and she was really upset because she felt like she had missed something important and something that she had called me about and told me that she was coming. And so as a result, I was called into management and they talked to me about it. Now, whether you agree with what I did or not really isn't the point of the story. The point that I want to share is what happened inside of me afterwards. I didn't think, wow, that was a really complex situation with competing variables and you did the best you could and, et cetera, et cetera. What I did think is, okay, how did I mess up? What did I do that was wrong? I should have handled that perfectly. I should have done it differently. I should have waited. I should have, all the stuff that my brain was spiraling. And looking back, I think, okay, that is control. On paper, I wanted to stick to my schedule and I had tried to follow it. In real life, though, I had to respond to variables that I had not written down. I had not taken into consideration. And what I didn't understand back then was flexibility is a skill. It is not a weakness. It is not sloppiness. It is not giving yourself a pass. It is not self-sabotage, but flexibility is a skill. And if your definition of consistency requires perfect alignment between your plan and your reality, well, guess what? You will always feel like you have failed. Consistency is not just sticking to paper. Consistency is building the skill of responding wisely when what you wrote down on paper or what you had planned or what your goal was doesn't actually match reality. So let's talk about when control breaks. And often we go into hypoarousal because when we operate from rigid control and want to follow everything that we had planned perfectly, and life happens and we get disrupted, sometimes we collapse and we think, I blew it. What's the point? I was doing so well until I got sick, until I went on vacation, until work got busy, until something happened that I wasn't planning on it. And that is when we can shut down and we don't care. We say, what's the point? There's no use. I've already blown it. I've already ruined my plan. I've already fallen off the wagon. I might as well just throw in the towel, those kind of things. And so we often vacillate between hyperarousal of control, more boundaries, more restrictions, to hypoarousal. And often control says we either need to be perfect or we have failed, where resilience and being flexible says we need to adjust and we can adjust. And so consistency really does live in the zone of resilience. And when we are living in that zone of resilience, that is when we can expect variables to happen. When we are flexible, when we are making progress, but living in the zone, it expects and accounts for illness, travel, emotional days, busy seasons. It asks, okay, what is possible right now, even though I didn't do it perfectly, even though that's not possible? What can I do now that, it rained on our parade? It isn't the thought of how do I execute this perfectly, or how did I not execute this perfectly? But it talks about how can I move in the right direction from here? Anything in the right direction is consistency. And I want to reiterate that small steps count. Lower intensity counts. Adjusted versions counts. Consistency is optimizing imperfect days, not perfect ones. I often tell my clients that when we are using consistency and being in our zone of resilience, then we plan for setbacks. And that's when we need to make a plan. It's really easy to have everything go perfectly when everything sticks to plans, but that rarely happens. And so when plan is falling apart in front of your eyes, then you need a plan for readjustment. You need a plan to pivot. You need to ask yourself, okay, who do I want to be right now? You need to be curious. What I love doing with my clients is helping to create a plan when life doesn't happen, which so many of us don't do. We just think, oh no, I made the plan, I'll control it, everything will be fine. Well, life is full of things that happen outside of our control. So what is your plan that you created when life falls apart, right? That is what being consistent and being curious and being in our zone of resilience helps us do. Now, some of you are going to say, what is the difference between being flexible and giving yourself a pass? Because sometimes a lot of us high achievers think if I loosen up, I'm just going to fall apart. And that's because a lot of us fear flexibility because it feels like lowering our standards, right? It sometimes feels like we aren't measuring up. We are letting ourselves off the hook. So let's just define it. Giving yourself a pass looks like things that you do that moves you away from your goal, right? It avoids discomfort. It says, I'm not feeling like it. I don't want to do it. And so I don't need to. It justifies self-sabotage. But when we're flexible, we are still moving towards our goal. We are maybe adjusting the intensity, and we are working in reality with our constraints and our variables that are facing us at that moment. So how do you know the difference? You just ask yourself, am I moving in the right direction? Am I making tiny, tiny, tiny steps towards my goal? Am I supporting my goal in some way? Am I supporting myself in a difficult situation and making a small progress? If the answer is yes, then you can say, okay, I am being consistent. I like to think of consistency as a dial, not a switch. And I like to use this metaphor as a light switch. A few years ago, we remodeled our house. And in our bathroom, we actually moved the light switch from one wall to the next wall. And still, this actually happened last week. Still, I go in there and sometimes I reach for the light switch and it's not there. And I just say, oh, I'm moving my hand to the actual wall. And there's no dismissing myself. There's no, oh my goodness, you're such an idiot. How can you put your hand there 5 years later and expect that the light switch is going to be there, right? My inner critic could really run wild with that. But what I do is I say, no, remember, the light switch is over here, and it's just a gentle reminder. And often we think that when we create habits or want to meet a goal, that it is on and off. And we are either on and we're doing it, or we're off and we're out. And that's what a switch is, right? We're either perfect or we failed. It's a lot of all or nothing. But I believe consistency is a dial. And so maybe today I'm working at my full capacity, but my full capacity today is only 40% because maybe I'm sick. Maybe I'm not feeling well. Maybe I have a limited amount of time because of an accident in traffic and et cetera, right? I don't have time to do my full workout that I had planned, but I can go for a walk. I can lift weights for 5 minutes. I can modify in some degree. And maybe tomorrow I'll be able to do more and I can do 70%. Maybe this week is lighter. Maybe today I'm going to think differently about my goal, right? Regardless, I am still engaged. And this is what I really want you to remember, is that consistency starts when things start to go wrong. That is where our control ends and where a lot of us throw the towel out, but that is where resilience begins. That is actually where we start to make progress and where we start to make goals happen, is when things actually go wrong and we become curious and flexible about how can we still make this work. So I want you to ask, where in your life are you tightening and trying to control more instead of adapting? Where does consistency depend on perfect conditions or all or nothing thinking or black and white or demanding perfection of ourselves and maybe other people? Next question is, where are you using control to try to create safety? And that's kind of the same thing. We like to control other people, our environment, our paper, our perfect planned day. And that often doesn't happen. I want to remind you that we are humans, and human beings are not robots. Human beings do not have perfectly aligned days. Nothing is repeatable with human beings, right? Even your night's sleep that you had tonight, there are so many factors that tomorrow night is not going to be exactly the same. I would love to create the same environment every single night, exactly the same, but it's really impossible in my world. So creating flexibility is the skill that you actually need. And it's not more discipline. It's not more willpower. It's not more control. It's actually less, because flexible people don't break. And I know that this is so hard for high achievers like me to wrap their mind around, but slowing down can speed things up because we learn to bend, we learn to adjust, we learn to stay in the process instead of restarting, creating a different strategy, that kind of thing. Consistency isn't about never missing, but it's always about returning. And I know they talk about this in Atomic Habits, how he says never miss twice. Okay, I love that. And remember that we can always adjust how we're doing. And I didn't learn to be flexible overnight. And honestly, I didn't even realize how rigid I was for so long. I thought that's the key to my success. I mean, it was for a while, but control burns us out. And as a nurse, as a high achiever, as a mom, control just felt really responsible and what I wanted to do. I felt strong. I felt capable. And I felt like if I just planned better, executed better, tightened things up more, then everything would go smoothly. But life doesn't cooperate like that. And in parenting especially, this has been one of my greatest teachers, that there are so many circumstances that aren't actually my problem to solve, right? My kids have their own personalities. They have their own challenges. They have their own perspectives. They have their own nervous systems, their own learning curves. And I used to live in this subtle state of fight or flight around all of this control that I couldn't really control. And I wanted to tighten and monitor and manage and try to optimize outcomes. Because if I could just control the environment enough, then everyone would be okay. And I learned that living in that state is totally exhausting, and that living in fight or flight can feel productive until you realize that you're, bracing yourself all the time and things fall apart. So what I've learned, even very slowly, is that adaptability is a strength, not forcing, not perfecting, but adjusting and breathing and asking yourself, what is possible here? Who do I want to be? There are moments now when something doesn't go according to plan, actually often with my kids, with my work, with my schedule. And instead of immediately tighten, I actually have learned to notice, to soften, to pivot. And that shift, which is really control to flexibility, has changed everything, because when you're not living in fight or flight, you can think clearly, right? Your logical brain comes online. You can be intentional in your actions. You can respond instead of react. You can stay connected to what's going on in the people around you and pivot. You can stay consistent. And this is what I love to help people do. I love to help high achievers understand why they tighten, why they white knuckle it, and sometimes why they collapse afterward. These are not character flaws. They are nervous system habits that can be shifted gradually. You can move from pressure-driven consistency to resilient consistency, which looks like, how did I do it perfectly? To, did I stay engaged? Did I move the needle slightly? Consistency is not about controlling every single variable, because that's impossible, but it's about staying steady and present when variables change. It's about bending without breaking. It's about coming back over and over and over again without the shame, without the judgment, without the inner critic running the show. And if you just take one thing from me today, let it be this: that consistency is not the switch that you flip, but it's a dial that we adjust. And resilience isn't built on perfect days. It's actually built on days that fall apart, that don't go according to plan, and we keep going. That is strength and growth. So thank you for listening. Every week, you're learning something new here on this podcast, and that is a powerful first step. But guess what? Information alone doesn't create transformation. True change happens when you start to think differently and shift the nervous system patterns that drive your behavior. As a coach and an emotional resiliency expert, that is the work I do. I love to walk alongside you, whether it's one-on-one, in a small group that you choose, or with your workplace team. I can help you retrain your brain and nervous system so that stress no longer runs the show. You'll find ways to connect with me in the show notes. Let's do this work together.